A 71-year-old farmer stood at his own back door in Oxfordshire, his jacket pressed for the morning he stood to lose everything. 3 generations had worked that land. 68 acres of stubborn Cotswold brash. Not a single local hand was raised to help. That same farm still carries the Beckwith name today. Because it wasn't a bank that came calling, it was a loyalty machine the countryside quietly switched on. And by the time this is over, the only question you'll be asking is why more farmers never noticed this pattern sooner. The farm began the way most small Cotswold farms begin. A farmhouse with a crooked chimney that had needed repointing since the Thatcher years. A Dutch barn with a roof that had seen considerably better decades. Land that had fed a family through 2 world wars, more than a few brutal harvests, and at least one summer so wet the wheat simply gave up and lay flat in the mud. Harold Beckwith, the farmer whose father had farmed it, and whose grandfather before him had borrowed against the land in the 90s, the way a great many small farmers did, to buy a combine he genuinely needed and couldn't otherwise afford. 2 bad harvests back to back. A wet summer that rotted half the barley before a single blade could cut it. A wife's illness that drained what savings remained, the way illness always does, quietly and completely. The London investment firm believed they were picking up distressed assets on the cheap. What they were actually doing was writing the opening scene of the most effective farming protest in British history. And they paid for every episode. The auctioneer set up on the tailgate of a Land Rover Defender, because of course it was a Defender. 68 acres, farmhouse, outbuildings, machinery, all listed. He read it the way you read something you've stopped allowing yourself to feel, because feeling it every single time would simply become unbearable. And there, at the very back of the yard, arms folded against a gatepost, stood Jeremy Clarkson, in wraparound sunglasses and a wax jacket that had clearly been through considerably worse weather than this. He wasn't talking to anyone. He hadn't been introduced to anyone. He'd simply appeared at some point that morning, without ceremony, and taken up a position where he could see everything while being noticed by no one in particular. Which, if you know anything about Jeremy Clarkson's track record of turning up at agricultural events across the Cotswolds, is itself a remarkable act of understatement. Understatement has never historically been his strongest suit. The London firm's representative opened with a figure that was insulting by design, the kind of figure that covers the bank's debt and leaves the family with essentially nothing to show for 41 years of 5 o'clock starts. Harold's daughter's hand found her father's arm and stayed there. That was the moment Clarkson, still leaning against the gatepost, pushed his sunglasses up onto his head and said, in a voice that half the yard immediately recognized, "That seems a bit stingy, if I'm honest." There was a pause. The kind of pause a village retells for years. The coffee, by all accounts, briefly stopped pouring itself. "Sorry, who are you?" said the auctioneer. "Not unreasonably, just a chap who likes this bit of countryside," came the reply. "Carry on, I'll bid when it's worth bidding." If you know the reputation Jeremy Clarkson has built across the last decade, and by this point, most of the yard had put it together, because there are not many men in England who combine a wax jacket, a Range Rover, and a face that's recognizable, then what came next won't surprise you particularly. Clarkson didn't bid low. Clarkson didn't bid politely. Clarkson bid the way he appears to do most things, with a slightly theatrical pleasure in watching the other man's expression shift with every raise of his hand. 10,000 became 15, 15 became 22. Somewhere in the mid-20s, the London man's phone rang, and he had a short, tense exchange with someone who was very clearly not authorizing him to go any higher. He folded the way men in sharp overcoats tend to when the number stops making commercial sense and starts making a point instead. The yard had gone almost entirely silent. Even the vicar's wife had stopped pouring coffee. Somewhere near the barn, a dog that had been barking at nothing all morning apparently sensed the change in the air and went quiet too. If you've ever stood in a farmyard, your own, a neighbor's, your grandfather's, watching something that mattered hang in the balance on a stranger's raised hand, then you already know the feeling I'm describing. That particular held breath. Jeremy Clarkson's presence in that auction yard was not coincidence. It was the most recent chapter in a pattern that had been building for years across Oxfordshire and the wider Cotswolds. A pattern of buying land no one else wanted, employing people the cities had long since stopped noticing, and insisting, loudly, repeatedly, on television and in print, that the countryside is worth considerably more than any spreadsheet gives it credit for. And if you want to understand why that matters, you have to go back further than the auction yard. You have to go back to the particular texture of what small farm life in the Cotswolds had become by the time Harold Beckwith found himself standing at that back door in a pressed jacket. Because the Cotswolds, to anyone who doesn't live there, is a postcard. It is honey-colored stone and dry stone walls and the kind of village pub that appears in television programs about the English countryside as though it has always existed and always will. It is weekenders in clean Wellingtons and estate agents' photographs taken on the one morning of the year when the light falls exactly right across the fields. It is, in short, a place that a great many people have very strong feelings about without ever having tried to make a living from its soil. To the people who do make a living from it, the picture is somewhat different. The soil across much of the higher Cotswolds is thin. It sits on top of limestone the way a carpet sits on a stone floor, present, technically functional, but offering very little in the way of forgiveness when things go wrong. It drains poorly in wet years. It bakes hard in dry ones. It grows certain crops tolerably well and refuses others with a stubbornness that feels almost personal. The farmers who work it have been working around those limitations for generations, and the knowledge of how to do that is not written down anywhere. It lives in the hands and the habits and the accumulated memory of families who have farmed the same ground long enough to know which field floods first and which lane becomes impassable in February, and which neighbor you call at 11 o'clock at night when the calving goes wrong and you need a second pair of hands before morning. That knowledge does not transfer to a London investment firm's balance sheet. It does not show up in the projected yield figures, or the asset valuation, or the 5-year plan drawn up in a glass-fronted office by someone who has never stood in mud at 5 in the morning trying to make a decision that the textbook doesn't cover. What shows up on the balance sheet is the debt. What shows up is the underperforming acreage. What shows up is the farmhouse that needs a new roof, and the barn that needs rewiring, and the equipment that is 15 years past the age at which a sensible person would have replaced it. What does not show up is the fact that Harold Beckwith knew every fence post on those 68 acres. That he knew which corner of the top field his grandfather had planted with an ash tree in 1953 because the wind came from that direction in winter and the cattle needed shelter. That he knew the name of the man at the grain merchant's who would tell him honestly, off the record, what the price was likely to do in the next fortnight. That he had spent 4 decades building, without ever calling it that, a network of relationships and mutual obligations, and quietly kept promises that constituted something far more valuable than anything the investment firm had paid for, and which the investment firm, having paid for the land, would never actually own. This is what gets lost in the conversation about rural decline, and it gets lost every single time. The argument that is made, in policy documents and agricultural reviews, and the kind of broadsheet opinion pieces that run every few years when a particularly bad harvest briefly makes farming visible to people who don't normally think about it, is that small farms are economically inefficient. That consolidation is inevitable. That the logic of scale is simply the logic of scale, and that sentiment is not a business plan, and that the correct response to a farm that cannot service its debt is to let the market do what markets do. That argument is not wrong, exactly. It is simply incomplete in a way that costs more than the spreadsheet ever records. Because what the spreadsheet doesn't capture is what happens to the village when the farm goes. Not just the fields. The fields will still be there. They will still be farmed, probably more efficiently, by the combine that covers 300 acres in a day rather than 68 in a week. But the farm as an institution, as a presence, as the thing around which a particular kind of rural life has organized itself for a century or more. That goes, and it tends to go quietly, and it tends not to come back. The pub loses the trade of the men who used to drink there on a Friday after the market. The agricultural merchant loses the account. The contractor who did the hedging loses a client and doesn't quite have enough work to keep his second vehicle on the road, so he sells it, and is then slightly less able to take on the kind of last-minute job that another small farm will need done urgently in 6 months' time. The school loses a child when the family moves away. The church loses the family, who'd been in the same pew since the building had a different roof. None of these losses are large enough, individually, to show up on any measurement that anyone is paying attention to. Together, over years, over dozens of farms in a single county, They constitute something that changes the character of a place so gradually and so completely that the people who might have objected find, when they look up, that the thing they would have objected to has already quietly finished happening. Jeremy Clarkson understands this. Not, one suspects, because he arrived in Oxfordshire with a theory about rural social capital and the economics of agricultural consolidation. He understands it because he has lived next to it, because he has watched it, because he has employed people from it, and bought produce grown in it, and spent enough years with his boots in the same mud as the people the spreadsheets tend not to count. And because, and this is perhaps the detail that explains everything else, he is constitutionally incapable of watching something he considers fundamentally wrong continue happening without saying something extremely loud about it. That particular quality has got him into trouble more times than either of us has the time to enumerate. In this instance, for reasons that are specific to the shape of the problem in front of him, it appears to have made him something considerably more useful than a television presenter with an opinion. It made him a market. That is the word that matters here. Not benefactor, not celebrity. Not the famous man who showed up and did something generous that one time and was photographed doing it. A market. A guaranteed, reliable, fairly priced, commercially serious market for the output of farms that had previously been entirely at the mercy of commodity prices set by people who had never seen the field the crop came from. When Hawkstone Brewery commits to buying barley at a fixed price from farms within a defined radius, it is not making a charitable gesture. It is making a commercial commitment that those farms can plan around, that they can borrow against, that they can make decisions on the basis of, in the way that any business needs to be able to make decisions, with some reasonable expectation that the ground beneath them will still be there next season. That is not a small thing. In the context of what small-scale British farming had become by the middle of the 2020s, that is an extraordinarily rare thing, and it is the thing that the story of Harold Beckwith's auction yard, true or not, precisely true or approximately true, or entirely invented and simply recognizable, is actually about. Not the famous man with his hand in the air, not the London firm's man with his phone and his sharp overcoat and his authorization limits, not the auctioneer on the tailgate of the Defender, or the vicar's wife and her coffee, or the dog that went quiet when the yard did. The thing the story is about is the market, and who controls it, and what it means for a family and a community and a particular piece of ground when someone decides to build one that works in their favor rather than against them. That is not a Cotswold story. That is not a farming story. That is not even, if you look at it from sufficient distance, a Jeremy Clarkson story. That is the oldest story there is, about who holds the power in a transaction and what happens when someone with the means and the inclination to change that balance decides, for whatever complicated mixture of commercial self-interest and genuine conviction, to do exactly that. The Beckwiths, if they exist, still farm their 68 acres. The ash tree in the corner of the top field, if it was planted in 1953, is now old enough to have outlasted the investment firm that thought it was buying something the family owned. Some things don't show up on balance sheets. That is rather the point. Now here is the part that even most people who followed this story closely have never quite joined together. Some say Clarkson paid the full amount on the spot, a check written on the tailgate of the Defender using his own knee as a desk. Some say he insisted the title go back into Harold's name outright. No strings, no mortgage, nothing. Simply returned the farm to the family it had always belonged to and told the solicitor to sort the paperwork however was legally cleanest. What we do know, what is not folklore, what is simply fact, recorded in accounts and annual reports and interviews on the public record, is that Jeremy Clarkson has spent the better part of several years doing, quietly and repeatedly, and at genuine financial risk to himself, precisely the sort of thing this story imagines him doing on one dramatic October morning. Clarkson's Hawkstone Brewery, built from scratch in Oxfordshire, uses barley grown within a handful of miles of where it's brewed. Not the cheapest barley the commodity markets could offer, barley bought at a fair price from local growers who would otherwise have had no real option but to accept whatever the wholesalers felt like paying that season. £21.3 million in annual revenue in 2025, 134% growth rate, £75 million valuation. A £50 million Carlsberg offer, rejected. Clarkson's farm shop limits its stock to whatever can be sourced within 16 miles. By policy, by choice, because the man behind it decided that mattered more than convenience or margin. £2 million in estimated annual revenue, 25,000 visitors a year, a queue phenomenon that became a weekly ritual. The 16-mile sourcing restriction became a loyalty machine that Tesco, with £65 billion in annual revenue, simply cannot replicate. The limitation is the product. It is the most counterintuitive business model in British broadcasting history. You cannot manufacture that. You can only find it and then point a camera at it. Clarkson's farm isn't the business. Clarkson's farm is the film set, and Amazon was paying the rent. £10 to £12 million in annual payments. Diddly squat proved it. £144 profit in year one. £45 million total farm valuation. The numbers don't lie. That is not farming. That is a media-powered agricultural enterprise. The London investment firms are still buying. The polite letters from banks are still arriving and still turning into requirements. The 68-acre farms across the Cotswolds are still counting the cost. But one farm turned every constraint into a competitive advantage, and the people who should have seen it coming were looking in entirely the wrong direction. Maybe there was no herald. Maybe no check was ever written on a knee in the October wind. Maybe Jeremy Clarkson wasn't physically standing in that auction yard on that particular morning. But somewhere in Oxfordshire, in 100 smaller, less dramatic, far less cinematic ways, that particular morning has been happening for years. One fair price, and one guaranteed contract at a time. Clarkson has been doing it publicly, repeatedly, at genuine financial risk to himself. Perhaps that's exactly why the story took root in the first place, and why it survived long enough to be told in this pub, and that one, year after year. Villages don't generally invent legends about strangers. They invent them about people whose character already fits the shape of the story being told. Jeremy Clarkson's character fits this one rather too well. If this is the kind of story that keeps bringing you back to this corner of the internet, then you're exactly the sort of viewer we make these for. Do subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss where we go next. Drop a comment and tell me, does a story like this have to be entirely true to be entirely worth telling? I'd genuinely love to know what you think. Did you ever visit Diddly Squat? And if you did, was the honey worth the queue? Thank you, as ever, for spending this time with us.